Sleepy Sheepy here. Today we're going to be looking at something a little bit different than my normal content, which is going to be some duels against some of the top players from the Elden Ring competitive ladder. And these players have played in tournaments. Snapcaster and Baemore are their usernames, and Snapcaster is like #1 on the PvP PlayStation ladder. It's not to say that he's like the best player in the world, just because we're missing a large portion of the player base, but it is to say that he's extremely good, plays the game very regularly, and has won money from this, come out on top of tournaments and been very successful in his career in terms of Elden Ring competitive play and Dark Souls competitive play as well. So being able to get this opportunity to play against these players really gave me some information about how I play the game, where I kind of stack up when it comes to the competitive scene, and just give me a taste for this element of Elden Ring that I hadn't really played before. And getting away from just invasions and content creation was nice, and it was just kind of refreshing. So before we jump into the duels, I just want to take a minute to go over the build and kind of my mindset going into this. If that's not really interesting to you and you just want to see the content, feel free to skip ahead. There should be bookmarks. But essentially, this was a fight club among friends, but we were also adhering to the competitive rule set associated with the PvP ladder. So that meant there were bans on certain things like Bloodhound Step, Endure, Fan Daggers, just kind of the more obnoxious or overpowered things that you might encounter in the Coliseum. And my strategy going into this was going to be to use something that I was familiar with. That was kind of my main goal. I didn't want to be botching swaps. I didn't want to be using something where I wasn't super sure on the timings of things, and I'd been running a curved greatsword as well as an offhand dagger for about the past week or two, so I've been pretty familiar going into this with the moves that I'd be dealing with and the timings and the range and all that stuff, and I could be a little bit more precise with all of my movement and whatnot. So that was kind of the decision here, and this was on a pure strength build. I did level it back up to 138 just for some other stuff that I was working on after the fight club, but it was 60 points into strength, 60 into vigor, and then maybe 16 in dexterity, and then 28 into endurance, and 10 in mind, I think was the kind of final tally. And that proved to be a pretty good setup. I think having this as a dexterity build rather than a strength build may have been a little bit better. I could have incorporated lightning, and that might have been a slight boost to the AR, but this was all fine. I like strength builds, and this wasn't there's no money on the line or anything like that. So the other thing that I want to mention is that I had a much more streamlined talisman layout. So if you watch me invade, you'll see many more talismans in my arsenal when I get set up for invasions, but for this, I was kind of expecting there's fewer things you have to deal with when you're in a competitive duel rather than when you're in an invasion where you might see anything. So really the goal was to just have talismans that I could swap to during the different stages of the fight. So the first stage being before I had taken any damage, I could use these two to boost my damage negation as well as my AR, and then I could switch over to something like the Shard of Alexander and the Blessed Dew in the middle of the fight. That way I'd have a little bit of passive regen, and I'd have the Shard of Alexander to just boost my AR if I was going to be going for my Ash of War. And you'll see in some of these fights that was decisive, so having that on hand was pretty helpful. And then I also had the option to switch over to the blue and red feather talismans if I was low on health, and that can be a great option to have on hand if you're low on health and you want to make a comeback. These can really be a difference maker. And then I did have the Bullgoat talisman on as an optional swap talisman, so I could switch over to the Claw talisman or put Blessed Dew on while I was low on health, so it might look something like this. And this was mostly if I was facing a weapon that I knew would poise break me every single time. So something like a greatsword is always going to poise break you, so there's no point in having a Bullgoat talisman on hand. That just about covers everything that I wanted to say about the build and kind of my mindset going into these duels. And if you have any questions, definitely let me know in the comments. I'll hopefully be playing these players again. I had a ton of fun, and if you wouldn't mind considering subscribing, I'd definitely appreciate it. But yeah, let's go ahead and take a look at the actual duels. Alright, so this first duel is going to be against Snapcaster running a thrusting sword, and I know that Snapcaster used that in I think one of the major tournaments in October. So there was a PlayStation tournament that involved like a lot of some of the best players in Elden Ring. I believe he took second place running a thrusting sword setup. I think it also did have Beast Roar on it, so that's a nice pressuring tool and a nice way to cover some ground. And he's not running that in this particular Fight Club, but it's at least a weapon that I know he's familiar with and one that I need to be careful when playing against. So I'm able to get a little bit of chip damage. He's able to get in 2 pretty strong hits that do quite a bit of health, and also pulls out the perfume. So that was one thing that I was definitely not set up for well going into this, was having a good use of like kind of consumables that were allowed in this tournament. So perfume is allowed, fan daggers are not, frost pots are not. I think you will see me accidentally throw one at some point, but fan daggers and frost pots are kind of my go-to in invasions, and not having consumables on hand was definitely one thing that I learned, was like, it would be nice to have those as just kind of a mix-up. Using perfumes like that is a great option. And so I do take a number of hits throughout the course of that first duel, and do kind of fall to Snapcaster pretty early on. You can also see that Snapcaster has the Spiral Horn shield on his back, so that's going to be a good way to kind of negate the frostbite damage. And you can see that I make an adjustment there and switch over to my heavy infused curved greatsword, which is definitely preferable in this particular fight. And here I do get a nice ravioli step that I was pretty happy about. The kind of wide sweep of the curved greatsword, especially in this smaller arena, is going to be really nice. And here I go for a sword dance, and I felt that the sword dance had a pretty complementary timing to the existing moveset that comes with the curved greatsword, where you have several moves and they all have somewhat similar timing, but the kind of wind up of the Ash of War sword dance on a curved greatsword can be pretty nice to mix things up a little bit. So here I get my first win of the Fight Club against Snapcaster, and it was definitely a close one. And then you'll see me facing Baemore here, who's using the dual straight swords. I don't know if our connection is perfect. I think there's like a little bit of a delay since there is an ocean between our 2 PlayStations. So I would say that might have been a slight factor here, at least for one of those straight sword hits, but like the other 3 or 4 were pretty much all my fault. And I should have kind of, respected them a little bit more. And we can see just, my attempt to get priority was definitely a poor choice in that particular duel. So moving on, we have another one against Snapcaster, and I played Snapcaster a little bit more than Baemore, mostly just because Baemore was doing kind of the hosting for the majority of the tournament, so Fight Club rather, not a tournament. But you can see here, I'm just trying to space, like making small adjustments. You'll see me stop and turn around a lot, and that's definitely something that I like to do. There's also kind of that classic like aggression wiggle that you can do when you're trying to go for a chase down against your opponent. You just kind of wiggle a little bit, and that can be a nice way to blend your attacks a bit, and just kind of make your timing a little bit more unpredictable. If you're just kind of running straight at your opponent, it can be a little bit harder to throw off their timing, but kind of going for that wiggle, I feel like is helpful. So here we do get a little bit of a connection issue where Snap just like teleports for a second, but it doesn't end up like being a factor in that moment, and we can kind of adjust. We do get a talisman swap on here, and if you're paying attention, that's something that I struggled with, was finding the time to swap my talismans appropriately. I think at a certain point I just kind of stopped using the first 2 in my set, the ritual sword and shield talismans, and mostly would just swap to the feather talismans at the end if I remembered. So the timing and space in an arena like this is very different than in the Coliseum. You can kind of get as much time and space as you want in the Coliseum just by running away, and you can make that time to apply those different talismans and whatnot. But in an arena like this, things are a little bit different. So here, Snapcaster unfortunately gets the backstab attempt, doesn't connect. We just kind of acknowledge the unfortunate nature of that. Here I get kind of a nice, just kind of dead angled attack, and that's one thing I really like about the curved greatsword, is just if you're gonna unlock from your opponent, you have some opportunities to swing and just have the sword connect in weird places that I think your opponent might not expect. And here the sword dance comes out really clutch as just kind of a finisher against Snapcaster, and I was really happy about that. Delaying that Ash of War until the end, kind of trying to bait my opponent into a sense of comfort with the moveset that they're expecting, and then pulling out something a little bit different. So there was that illegal frost pot. I didn't get banned. Everyone was very gracious and nobody even mentioned it. But yeah, that's something I'm not allowed to use, and having, again, like perfumes on hand would have been something that I'd like to see. So one thing that I noticed as well was that I was not running the right physics setup. So I was running a tier to give me some health if I was close to death, which I think was the right choice, but I was also running a strength knot. And having the strength knot on versus something like, I believe it's the Opaline hard tier, which is just a tier that negates all types of damages, was really a problem when facing these power stance straight swords. And really it just would have been helpful throughout the course of this. I didn't really need the extra strength, and you can see by the amount of damage I take versus the amount of damage my opponents are taking that having a tier that just lowers the amount, just something more on the defensive side would have been much, much smarter. And I think if I do this again, I will absolutely change that tier up, and I might change it up for invasions too. I think I have been running more aggressive base tiers throughout the course of just kind of Elden Ring in general, and I think having something more defensive is a smarter way to approach it. I heard G9 say that. Here I just want to mention kind of that swap that I had. So I did have Beast Roar on the Misericord, and that was really useful as just kind of a change up. So nobody in the arena had seen that yet, and being able to pull that out against jumping attacks, which are so common when it comes to the power stance straight swords, I think that was part of the difference maker, and it really kind of shifted the momentum of that particular match against Baemore in my favor, and helped me come out with a W against just such a strong setup. So having things like that in your back pocket that you can kind of surprise your opponent with, I think are great. We will also note that Snapcaster has changed his build, and he's got a Faith setup here. He's got a buff Erd Steel dagger on in his offhand, and that thing absolutely melted me. Like, I was thinking about going for a parry there. I didn't have the shields in the right spot, and it mostly was just like I know that I'm going to lose this particular duel, so I might go for something fun, but I didn't even manage to get the shield out, and just got absolutely melted by that Faith build. So that adjustment of Snapcaster to switch from the thrusting sword over to halberd off dagger, I think was a really smart move, and it's also one of the setups that I historically have played more poorly against. The halberd playstyle has oftentimes punished me and made me just kind of regret making moves that I would normally be able to pull off. Either like trying to bait attacks against a halberd can be really hard, because if you go for like a whiff trying to bait a halberd, they'll oftentimes be able to just cover the ground and deliver that hit and just punish you for what oftentimes you wouldn't get punished for. So this next duel was just against Baemore here, and he does throw out the thrusting sword, and it was really smart to have something like Frostbite on that, because even though I think that would have not hit me for damage, it did hit me for at least a phantom hit, which then resulted in the damage of the frost proc while I was midair, and I ended up losing that duel because of that. I think if I had been able to dodge that damage with the jump and deliver a jumping attack, I would have come out on top, but no such luck there. So we do have another duel against Baemore here with the power stance straight swords, and I'm doing, I think, a decent job of trading with it, especially given the fact that he's probably got the Opaline hard tier on and I don't. And I think I do have some good pressure to just kind of keep him on the back foot, even with such a powerful setup. But kind of the playstyle with power stance straight swords is you really wait for your moment, and he's trying to create those moments with some of these consumables. So that's a really smart play. I'm trying to pay attention more to his placement than the placement of the consumables. I'd much rather take damage from those consumables than the power stance straight swords. And here, unfortunately, I don't connect my sword dance, and that ends up being kind of the final blow where he's able to switch to a thrusting sword and come out on top. If you made it this far, I just wanted to say thanks so much for watching, and if you have any questions, definitely let me know. And if you like this type of content where, I'll duel some better players and show my wins and my losses and just kind of talk about the process as a whole, definitely let me know in the comments. I definitely enjoy invasions too, but kind of part of my growth as a player and my goal to get better as a player, it involves playing some players one-on-one who I know are really good and who will oftentimes beat me. So just losing to better players teaches you a lot, and winning against players who are better than you also teaches you a lot. So that's been kind of my goal, and if you'd like to see content around it, definitely let me know. But yeah, that's all I've got, and I hope you have a good one.